Good afternoon. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on hospitality and human rights. It's my honor today to be joined by our panelists, service providers in the hospitality industry, and members of the public from all across the province. My name is Leisha Cambor, and I'm the Manager of Outreach and Engagement at the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's session. I would first like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we are joining today. The Alberta Human Rights Commission acknowledges that what we call Alberta are the traditional and ancestral territories and gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples. This includes 45 First Nations and 140 reserves, who are subject to Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, Métis settlements and lands, the 5 territories of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and the Inuit who have lived on and cared for these lands for generations. More than ever, Indigenous human rights issues are front and center. We are all being called on to take meaningful action to ensure that our organizations are barrier-free and that our programs and services meet the needs of and are accessible to Indigenous Albertans. As part of our own Indigenous human rights strategy, the Commission is committed to reviewing our programs and services in consultation with our Indigenous Advisory Circle and the community to ensure that they are culturally relevant and center Indigenous perspectives, issues, and ways of knowing. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and for those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on. No matter where you are joining from today, I encourage each of you to spend a moment reflecting on the land where you work, play, and live, and how you can forward truth and reconciliation in your community, work, and life. A quick disclaimer before we jump into our discussion today. Please note that the content of today's webinar will contain legal information, but is not intended to be legal advice. To ensure everyone can fully engage with today's content, I would now like to highlight some key housekeeping and accessibility information. We will be recording today's webinar and will send out a link to the video once it's available for you to rewatch or share. We are pleased to offer American Sign Language interpretation provided by Flick Interpreting and closed captioning services courtesy of KLM Captioning. These services are available via the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will also be sharing a link in the chat for you to access closed captioning. Thank you to those who submitted questions in advance of today's session. While there will be no question and answer period for this webinar, we will attempt to answer the questions submitted to us at registration through the content of our discussion today. Lastly, near the end of today's session, you will be prompted to fill out a short survey. Please fill this out as your feedback is incredibly valuable to us in making these sessions as impactful as possible and also supports the planning for future opportunities. Before jumping into today's discussion on hospitality and human rights, I wanted to provide a bit of background information. The Alberta Human Rights Commission is an independent commission of the Government of Alberta, created by the Alberta Human Rights Act. Our mandate is to foster equality and reduce discrimination. We do so by providing public information and education programs, such as today's webinar, and by helping people resolve human rights complaints. The Commission recognizes the fundamental principle that all persons are equal in dignity, rights, and responsibilities. We aim to create a province where all people can participate in and contribute to its cultural, social, economic, and political life. We champion Alberta's multiculturalism and encourage equality of opportunity for all. For more information on the Commission, please check out our website and subscribe to our social media channels for timely updates. Today's webinar is to support the republication of the Commission's Human Rights in the Hospitality Industry Guide. The 2025 version of the guide includes current case law, including new relevant Alberta cases, as well as updated Commission policies and guidelines. This guide has 2 main goals, with the first being to inform service providers in the hospitality industry about strategies to prevent discrimination and ensure their businesses are inclusive for employees and patrons alike. The second goal of this publication is to also inform patrons of their rights and responsibilities under the Alberta Human Rights Act. While today's discussion is about our recently published Human Rights in the Hospitality Industry Guide, the Commission has many resources available on a variety of human rights topics. These resources include short information sheets, in-depth guides, videos, publications, promotional items, and more. I encourage you to visit our website to explore our offerings or to get in touch with us if you would like to order paper copies for your workplace. We are also pleased to offer online workshops on human rights in the workplace several times a year. These workshops are a valuable opportunity to learn about human rights in an interactive environment. You can register for these workshops via our website, with our next session occurring later this month on November 25th and 26th. Lastly, if you require human rights information, we invite you to access our confidential inquiry line, where you can speak to a human rights officer in real time. Please refer to the Zoom chat for information on all the resources I just spoke to. Now, moving on to today's webinar, it is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists who will be sharing their insights, expertise, and experience with us. Our first panelist is Melissa Moisey. Melissa is an experienced human rights professional who has worked at the Alberta Human Rights Commission for over 11 years. Currently Director of Complaints Management and the Commission's Deputy Director, Melissa leads a team of human rights officers responsible for managing human rights complaints in the Director's decision-making process. She was previously a human rights officer responsible for investigating and resolving complaints. Melissa's experience in both frontline case management and strategic leadership has provided her with valuable insight into how human rights principles apply in practice across diverse communities and sectors, including the hospitality industry. Good afternoon, Melissa. Thanks so much for joining today's discussion.
Thanks, Leisha. Happy to be here.
Our next panelist is Natalie Wild. Natalie Wild is an HR and workforce development advisor with the Alberta Hotel and Lodging Association, also known as the AHLA. She brings 8 years of human resources experience and a strong foundation in Alberta's hospitality industry, including hands-on experience as the human resources generalist at the JW Marriott Edmonton Ice District. Her deep understanding of hotel operations fuels her passion for helping employers build inclusive, compliant, and people-first workplaces. Natalie led the development of a human rights toolkit tailored for hotels, featuring clear legislative guidance, sample policies, procedures, and checklists. This toolkit not only complements the Alberta Human Rights Commission's recently published Hospitality Guide, but also supports the AHLA's Elevate HR and Safety program. This program helps hotel employers assess and improve their practices against Alberta's human rights, employment standards, and OHS legislation. Her combined experience in hotel HR and legislative advisory work makes her a perfect fit for this panel. Natalie brings practical, actionable insight into how human rights can be embedded into every part of hotel operations, ensuring safer, fairer workplaces across the industry. Natalie, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And our last, but certainly not least panelist is Sean Crump. Sean Crump is a recognized leader in universal design and disability inclusion, with a career shaped by his lived experience as a quadriplegic since 2004. Currently serving as Director of Accessibility at ATB, Sean is driving a long-term strategy to create industry-leading disability inclusion for clients, teams, and employees, emphasizing transparency, collective understanding, and proactive improvement. As a social entrepreneur, Sean founded Universal Access, pioneering a certification framework that integrated international accessibility standards, and later led Included by Design, a company developing digital solutions to support inclusive spaces. His leadership extends to shaping policy and standards nationally and provincially, contributing to initiatives like the CSA B652 Residential Housing Standard and the Accessible Canada Act. A sought-after speaker and TEDx presenter, Sean has been recognized with awards including the Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Medal, Top 40 Under 40, and the Marilyn Steiner Achievement Award. He's also been featured in a TELUS Originals documentary for his impactful work. Beyond his professional commitments, Sean enjoys time with his wife and 2 sons, embracing life with purpose and joy. Sean, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Thanks for joining the panel.
Yeah, thanks for including me. Excited to talk more about this.
Yes, I am too. Well, now moving along, I'm going to jump into our first question of the day. Now that you know a little bit more about our panelists, I'd like to know what service providers fall under the hospitality industry and what laws apply to them. Melissa, I'd like to kick this panel off with you.
Great, thanks. So the hospitality industry includes a wide range of service providers offering temporary accommodation to the public, like hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts, and vacation rentals. It also includes public service providers like restaurants, bars, and nightclubs. The Alberta Human Rights Act applies to all of these service providers in the hospitality industry, specifically Section 4 of the Act, which says that service providers must not deny or discriminate with respect to goods, services, accommodation, or facilities that are customarily available to the public because of the 15 protected grounds listed in the Act. So those grounds are race, color, ancestry, place of origin, mental disability, physical disability, age, gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, religious beliefs, and source of income. You can find all of those on our website if you didn't catch the whole list. So really what this means is that service providers have a responsibility to ensure that they provide their services in a way that doesn't treat people negatively based on any of those protected grounds. And they also have an obligation to accommodate a service recipient up to the point of what's called undue hardship based on the service recipient's needs connected to the protected ground. So when we're talking about accommodation in a human rights context, what we mean is making changes to services, policies, or physical environments in order to reduce or eliminate the negative impact that a person faces because of their protected grounds. Service providers must accommodate up to the point of undue hardship, which means that they must provide accommodation unless doing so would cause an unreasonable burden on the service provider. And in order to reach that point of undue hardship, there must really be no reasonable or practical options available.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. I think it's a really great way to start off with the parameters set out in the Alberta Human Rights Act. Natalie, I'd love if you could share your thoughts on this question as well, given your orientation and direct experience with the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Leisha. So, as Melissa mentioned, I think she covered a lot of them, but Alberta really does have a wide range of businesses that fall under that service provider. She mentioned hotels, motels, lodges, restaurants, bars. I think event venues maybe was missed. That one falls under there as well. But basically, any place that offers accommodation, food, or beverage service to the public. The HLA specifically supports hotels and convention centers, and part of that support includes helping them understand their legal responsibilities under the Alberta Human Rights Act. That means that service providers have a duty to make sure that their spaces and their services are free from discrimination. They can't deny service or treat someone unfairly or create barriers based on things like Melissa mentioned race, gender, disability, or any of the protected grounds. And it's not just the Human Rights Act that they need to follow. Hospitality businesses also have to comply with other legislation, such as the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Employment Standards Code, and the Alberta Building Code as well, which includes some accessibility requirements, which I'll touch a little bit more on, I think, later on. So it's really about creating safe and inclusive environments, and not just because, it's the law or it's legislation, but because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Natalie. And thanks for also highlighting those other important pieces of legislation that intersect with the hospitality industry. I think this is really great foundation to kick off our questions for today. So now that we know a little bit more about the hospitality industry and who's covered under it, what are important considerations for service providers when thinking about their human rights responsibilities? Sean, given your extensive experience in accessibility, I'd like to hear from you first on this one.
Thanks. Yeah. I think the first and foremost element of consideration is like when you're always trying to just meet the newest standard, the newest criteria, the newest minimum, you're always going to be evolving this. When considering human rights and kind of the impact that it creates to your clients, potential employees, and just groups in a kind of larger sense, it's what are the best practices that you can employ? What are kind of the global standards that you can exemplify in your space, especially as you're going through updates, revisions, iterations? And so what elements exist or are missing that may exclude a certain equity-seeking group? Do they limit any accessibility services, resources that can potentially be offered? When you're looking at your space collectively as a whole, some of this is outlined in building code and standard, and some of it isn't because there's temporary elements that exist in any of these given spaces, furniture layout, spaces in that type of consideration. And I think kind of getting more into the meat of it for a little bit more specific examples, how are you collecting the accessible needs of accommodations and requirements that people may have, whether it's from your staff or whether it's from potential guests that are planning on utilizing or patronizing your space? Where do you interact with these guests when you're checking them in at a hotel or motel or lodging? Are you behind a service counter that may be too high for somebody in a mobility aid like a wheelchair? Are you offering to, take the I don't even know what it would be called because I'm not, but like the incoming information or whatever it might be during a check-in? Are you offering to take that information at a lower service area, or even offering to sit at a table and take that information, so somebody can be at eye level? Simple things like that can help remove the physical elements that may not be in place quite yet. Different print options for people that are hard of sight. So as you have information about the hotel, where somebody's room may be, do you have different print size options for anybody who's hard of sight or people that may be blind? Do you have a clear evacuation plan in case of an emergency? And are those maps clearly posted? Do people know if they're in a mobility aid, which exit they need to utilize? If not all of your exits are wheelchair accessible. And how are you indicating that to guests upon arrival, whether that's in a restaurant or at a hotel? What is your internal accessibility checklists look like for events, engagements, or activities that you offer? Do you have one that exists? Do you utilize kind of third-party event planners for that? Having one that's specific to your space and your location may be a good bar to set for any events that are taking place at the given venue. And then again, I think more specifically to like hotels and rooms, do you have clear information about what those rooms look like? Because everything's so variable, especially across the provinces, accessible rooms can mean a lot of different things. So how specific are you getting about that information? Are you clearly identifying, the door widths, bed heights, the washrooms, space around the beds? Do you have a map? Do you have a guide? Do you have this information? Should it be requested more specifically? And then how are you collecting the feedback after the guests or patrons have kind of visited your space? Is it passive, or are you trying to actively collect this information from that lived experience to help create a more robust plan? I think those are some areas that can really help strengthen and make sure that you're not just kind of going through the typical box checking exploration as often is the case.
Yeah, that's great, Sean. Thank you for those examples in particular. I think that's really helpful. Melissa, given your breadth of experience with the Alberta Human Rights Act and resolving human rights complaints, I'd like to hear from you next about your thoughts on this question.
Sure. I'd suggest a number of important considerations. So to start, service providers need to be aware of those 15 protected grounds of discrimination and the ones that might be more likely to come up in hospitality, like mental and physical disability, gender expression and identity, and race and color. We sometimes hear service providers talking about having a right to refuse service for any reason as a private business, but under human rights, they can't do so in connection to any of those protected grounds. And one principle that human rights law establishes is that the protected ground doesn't need to be the entire reason for the refusal of service in order to be discriminatory. It only needs to be a factor. Another thing to be aware of is that intention is not necessary to establish discrimination. So a service provider can have a policy or a practice that seems neutral because it applies equally to all service recipients, but it can still have a negative effect on someone because of their protected ground. So an example of this would be a hotel that has a very strict no animal policy. They're not necessarily saying outright or with intention that they don't welcome people with disabilities, but the policy, if it's applied very strictly, would have a negative impact on someone with a service animal. Next, service providers should be aware that human rights law has primacy over other provincial laws and internal policies. So having a particular rule or a policy is not sufficient against a claim of discrimination. So if we again use the example of a hotel with a no animal policy, simply having that policy or rule is not enough to relieve the hotel of its duty to accommodate a person with a service animal because human rights law has primacy over that hotel's internal policies. Service providers should also consider their duty to accommodate. So when a person requests accommodation, a service provider must consider that request with an individual assessment of what that person's needs are. And I talked before about accommodating to the point of undue hardship. So I'll just talk a little bit more about that concept. It's a really high bar to meet for service providers. The term undue implies that service providers are obligated to accept some level of hardship when they're providing accommodation. And a service provider is unlikely to be able to establish undue hardship before they've taken some pretty significant steps to attempt accommodation. Another consideration is that businesses, all of these businesses in the hospitality industry, they're responsible for the actions of their employees. So it's really important to ensure that employees are aware of and following policies prohibiting discrimination in the workplace and against service recipients. And one final consideration, service providers should also be aware of the recourse someone has if they are discriminated against. So if someone has reasonable grounds for believing that they experienced discrimination, they can make a human rights complaint with the Commission within 1 year after the alleged discrimination happened. And so if we accept that complaint, the service provider then gets an opportunity to respond in writing. And then we use a process called conciliation, where a human rights officer works with the parties to try and reach an agreement to resolve the complaint. If the complaint doesn't resolve, the director of the commission makes a decision to either dismiss the complaint or refer it to a human rights tribunal. And so with that in mind, if you're ever in a position where you need to respond to a human rights complaint, records can be really helpful. So if you have a situation where someone is seeking accommodation from you that you might not be able to provide, or is raising a concern to you that they believe they've been discriminated against, keep records and documents about the situation and how you're making your decisions.
That's great, Melissa. Thanks for providing such good human rights considerations, as well as also elucidating some parts of the human rights process here at the Commission. Lastly, Natalie, given your experience working directly with industry, I'd like to open the floor to you for any additional points of consideration for how service providers can best fulfill their human rights responsibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as Melissa and Sean touched on, I mean, there's a lot of things to consider. But I'd kind of like to hone in on three things in particular. I want to talk about accessibility and staff training and having those clear policies. When service providers think about their human rights responsibilities, it's really about putting people first, and I think we need to remember that. That's what's at the heart of it. And they need to ask, are we treating everyone with dignity, with fairness, with respect? I think accessibility in your business comes first. So service providers need to make sure that their spaces and how they communicate with their guests and the services themselves are welcoming and usable for everyone, including guests with disabilities. For example, when a hotel begins a renovation, the first step is usually defining the scope of work and setting up a budget. And that budget ends up driving almost every other decision that they make. But one thing that sometimes gets overlooked is accessibility. So for both guests and employees. I actually had a conversation recently with a hotel that was in the beginning stages of a renovation, and they wanted to know if Alberta had an accessibility act that would require them to have a certain number of guest rooms that are accessible. And I said, no, Alberta is among a few provinces in Canada that doesn't actually have a standalone accessibility act to set out those broad accessibility standards. However, under the Alberta Building Code, there are accessibility requirements depending on the scale of the renovation. And that word scale kind of became important within the conversation. But for example, just to kind of explain that, accessibility standards apply if your renovation does things like changes guest room layouts or adds new rooms, or if you're renovating lobbies or entrances or corridors, if you're updating public or common space washrooms, or if your renovation is going to impact any barrier-free paths, or if the renovation is only doing surface level updates like your carpets, your finishes, and your lighting, these rules are not as likely to be triggered. And so we were going back and forth and discussing these details. And the hotel wanted to know, well, how do we determine, the scale of our renovation? Because we just want to avoid having to implement accessible rooms if we don't have to, because it's more expensive and it's a cost thing. So I share this story not to criticize the hotel, but to just kind of build awareness that I think there's a common belief that creating accessible spaces comes with a big price tag. But there's a lot of research now. I was looking at some research recently from a course that we have from Stats Canada, and it actually shows the opposite, that prioritizing accessibility actually leads to long-term financial and operational benefits that far outweigh those initial costs. There's a couple of reasons why employees with disabilities tend to stay longer, which means lower recruitment and onboarding costs. More accessible hotels tend to attract a wider range of guests. So, seniors, people with disabilities, their families included. And the accessible travel market is actually estimated to be worth billions of dollars. And travelers with disabilities are often extremely loyal customers. They'll return and be repeat customers. And accessibility can also open a lot of doors to government contracts and funding programs that can offset the cost of making those improvements or making your space more accessible. So the cost of accessibility shouldn't be seen as an expense. It's really an investment in people and in guest satisfaction and in long-term profitability. So I wanted to share that because I found that very interesting. My second point that I wanted to speak to was staff training and awareness. So frontline staff, as we know, are really the face of an organization. So it's really essential that they understand how to uphold human rights in everyday interactions. I've seen some hotels offer their teams training on privacy or cultural sensitivity, gender inclusivity. So teaching them how to use gender neutral greetings or recognizing that not all guests identify strictly as male or female. And those small shifts can really make a big difference in how welcome someone feels in your business. And the third piece is having those clear policies and procedures. So written policies aren't just about compliance. It's also to help set the standard for consistent and respectful behavior across the organization. So, for instance, a hiring manager might use like a candidate evaluation form during interviews that helps focus solely on skills and qualifications and avoids questions that could lead to discrimination, like asking about someone's age or their family status. So service providers who embed inclusion into their daily culture, or who invest in inclusion and diversity training for their staff, they're really strengthening their entire business because at the end of the day, human rights responsibilities aren't just about avoiding harm. They're about creating spaces where everyone feels safe and respected and valued. And that starts with a thoughtful design of your property and empowering your staff, and a culture that puts people first.
That's great. Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you to all of our panelists. A lot of really wonderful considerations coming out of that for us to all take from today. So moving along to our next question, I'd love to know from each of you, what can service providers do to ensure that their services or establishments are free from discrimination? And what should they have in place to deal with complaints or concerns when they arise? Natalie, I'm actually going to go back to you to start this one off again. Sorry, Natalie, you're just on mute.
Apologies. Yeah, so I talked about it a little bit just now, but staff training and awareness is a really big one. I think employers need to start with their staff, with their employees, and understand that not all discriminatory acts are malicious, of a malicious nature or even purposeful. Melissa kind of touched on that. Sometimes they happen simply due to a lack of training or awareness. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. So providing resources and training on different types of bias or accessibility measures, or even that cultural sensitivity training that I spoke about, is kind of the first step. Secondly, I think having strong and clear policies, as I mentioned as well, around human rights, such as something like a respectful service policy that sets out really clear expectations for staff behavior, and kind of outlines how customers will be treated, I think is another important thing to think about. But even with these things in place, unfortunately, sometimes complaints still happen. So it's important that employers have a clear complaint process, having a simple, transparent procedure for handling these concerns, whether they come from a guest or from an employee. This should include how to report issues, who reviews them, how to follow up. And even if an organization, I know this is a question that has come up a little bit, even if an organization doesn't have a human resources department, the employer or the owner or whoever is responsible for operations is also responsible for handling those human rights concerns and doing so appropriately. I know lots of smaller hotels who do not have an HR department or a dedicated HR person, but that doesn't exempt them from their human rights responsibilities. So when there is no HR person within an organization, I recommend that an employer designates a responsible person, appoint a manager, a supervisor. It could even be the owner as the point of contact for human rights issues, and ensure that they understand the process for handling complaints. And if people on the call today don't know where to begin with developing a policy or a complaint procedure, or providing training to your staff, the Human Rights Commission has a ton of resources. Or if you're a hotel on the call today, the HLA can also help with developing these types of things. So, yeah.
Yeah, those are great points. And thanks for plugging our resources. I know we'll chat a little bit more about those later on. Sean, I'd like to go to you next. What is your perspective on this question, given your background?
Yeah, Natalie kind of hit the nail on the head with a lot of those points. I think part of it is making sure that when you are incorporating training, it's not specifically focused on clients exclusively. I think by making sure that you incorporate leadership training for any staff or any employees or any groups that are part of the team or extended team are really important. I think by incorporating people who have lived experience into those trainings, oftentimes they're digitally provided, but having an organization or group come in to help provide some of that firsthand experience with things allows people to envision what that effect and what those causes may have kind of in those real life scenarios, so that it's not just following a standard or following a code or a guidance, but really what those impacts may look like. Having those clear accommodation policies and plans in place, so that not only is it something that an individual, whether it's booking a room or a table, requiring accommodations, or a staff individual is looking for accommodations to complete their job or fulfill their job, has to kind of inquire about broadly, having some transparency around what those accommodations look like, what could be offered, what types of things exist within the organization and business, really helps create a steadfast understanding and maybe a little bit of an easement for people when requesting those types of accommodations firsthand, especially if they're new to the position or trying or experiencing the restaurant or hotel for the first time and not really sure about how to navigate all of those unique pieces. And then from the complaints follow up, I think having multiple ways of collecting that information. Not everybody has readily available access to internet or email or digital resources. So having, the old school phone, mail, as well as digital resources, collecting it. And then what does that follow-up process look like? How are you following up with the guest or the employee or the individual that's filed the complaint? How are you adjudicating that complaint? What are you doing to rectify what that looks like? Are you bringing in some kind of expertise? Are you utilizing resources that are available or at your disposal? And making sure that this goes, without notice or doesn't go without notice. And then again, having that secondary follow-up with not only the guest, but the larger community as a whole to show that these issues have been resolved or at least acknowledged and that the steps are in place, and really telling the story about that journey in moving towards becoming more accessible and inclusive.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Sean. I really like the points about ensuring that we're meaningfully centering lived experience and finding ways to include diverse perspectives. Rounding out this question, Melissa, I'm eager to hear your perspective from the commission lens.
Well, I think Natalie and Sean have really covered it, so I'll maybe just add a couple brief things. So first, I think when you're thinking about human rights or respectful service or an anti-discrimination policy, I would suggest the inclusion of a process for providing accommodation and how accommodation requests are responded to and actioned, so that staff are aware of how to manage these situations when they arise. I think it's important to provide training to employees on the policies and on human rights legislation, which I think Natalie said already, but I would echo that. And I would also echo Sean's suggestion about engaging with people with lived experience or other expertise in accessibility or human rights. You don't need to come up with all of this stuff on your own. There's experts out there that you can consult with. You can also consult with the Commission and our confidential inquiry line for information on human rights specifically, or to discuss specific situations that you're managing. And if you're looking for some more specific advice on how to respond to a situation, you could also consider seeking legal advice. In terms of responding to complaints, I would also echo the suggestion about a clear and transparent complaint process that includes someone who is trained and designated to respond to complaints, take action in response to complaints, and follow up as necessary.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you to the panel. Lots of really great suggestions around training and making sure we have clear complaint processes and really making sure we're consulting experts when necessary as well. So moving along here to our fourth question of the day. From your experience, what is being done to improve accessibility, and what more do you think the industry can do to make its services and spaces more inclusive? Sean, I'd like to kick this question off with you.
Thanks. Yeah, personally, I've seen a lot of improvement, especially over the last 5 years, where 1 in 3 restaurants or spaces were accessible. Just in my own life, and kind of being in this space all the time, I know the kind of questions to ask when I am making a booking or requests for any of these types of things, and the clarity in which these questions are being answered have become far better responded to and a lot clearer. So oftentimes, not 50%, but maybe a little bit less than, I would have, arrived to a new restaurant or a space after having a conversation or inquiring about its accessibility to see that it wasn't actually accessible, and that the interpretation of like, well, we could just, do X, Y, and Z to help you get into the space, or to, help you sit at a table that isn't at an appropriate height. And again, those weren't really the things that were asked, and oftentimes they aren't able to be met. So to have that starting to decrease in a very noticeable way, and having kind of those experiences now at a minimum, as opposed to often enough that is discouraging. I feel like it's revitalizing and encouraging more and more people with disabilities, not only to get out and experience spaces more often, but also to experience or inquire about job opportunities at any of these given in any of these specific industries. Seeing accessibility legislation has certainly helped. Seeing provinces adopt these legislations is great. Alberta and PEI are a little slow to this game yet, but seeing Alberta sign a memorandum of understanding last year about adopting or doing more due diligence on a provincial legislation is certainly steps in the right direction to see that come to fruition here in Alberta. And I think the biggest note there is it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. So for people like Natalie had mentioned, for people that are looking at this as, an incurred cost and an expense, of course there's budget allocation that has to be put towards it, but this isn't a question of like, maybe you should do it now. It's about sustainability. If you're not going to do it now, you're going to have to do it at some point soon. And the grandfathering that exists today isn't going to exist with the legislations as we've seen them develop, following in line with the federal legislation. So again, it's a matter of, if you're going to do it anyways, or do a renovation anyways, why not be proactive on some of these things? And so again, I think we're starting to see some of that evolution exist. I think more and more businesses are understanding some of those benefits and values. An individual with a disability isn't just that individual, it's the community around that person. So if you are trying to attract more guests or more people to your establishment or business, there's a really, really unique way to go about that. And again, at this point in time, still a differentiator. People with sensitivities, neurosensitivities, or environmental sensitivities aren't looking for the Friday, Saturday bookings. They aren't looking for the restaurant booking at, 7, 9 o'clock on a Friday. They're looking at, the 5 o'clock on a Wednesday. So as we see the weekly ebbs and flows of a restaurant, like how do you create more sustainable business throughout the week? You start appealing to a broader group of people that maybe have specific differences and intentions about how they like to utilize the space and how they like to capture some of those environments. So again, I think there's some evolution to like how business models are being created, how they can utilize and explore people of varying needs and people with varying experience desires. I think generating opportunities through employment and community engagement for all people is also a piece that really helps benefit the organization as a whole. We know that there's hiring gaps that are starting to exist. We know people are retiring at a greater volume now than entering the job market. We also know there's a huge percentage of post-secondary graduates or people getting their post-secondary degrees that are living on social incomes. And so if they have the fortitude and aptitude to get through a degree or university, they're probably a pretty good candidate for a role or an opening that exists within your organization, creating not only the accessible environment, but the inclusive environment through some of the training and other pieces that we've touched on today will help further that growth. So I think we've seen a lot of evolution occur. I think there's still a lot more to come, and have it seen kind of more broadly across all of the industry itself. But I think really getting out of the mindset that you're building or creating a space for the 20%, now 27% of Albertans living with disabilities, but you're creating a space for 100% of the people. And you can, again, attest that to how many people going to the 5th floor of a building take stairs versus an elevator, how many people with a scooter use the curb cutouts, all of these accessible features that already exist in our environment that were created for people with disabilities have become mainstream. How many more of those are going to exist in the spaces as that adaptation and evolution continues to grow?
Thank you, Sean. I think that's great. I really like that paradigm shift about how ultimately these types of policies benefit everybody and make good business sense and are also proactive. So thank you for that. Natalie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question given your work with the AHLA.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm more well-versed to speak to this question from a hotel perspective, but I think from my experience, many hotels are starting to be a little bit more intentional and think more intentionally about how their spaces and their services can better support guests and their employees with diverse needs. I've seen, more and more hotels, aside from my one example earlier, that are taking a meaningful and a really proactive approach to support inclusivity. Some are proactively renovating or upgrading their rooms to better meet accessibility needs before a request for that arises. I've seen improved signage, using a lot more inclusive language in anything guest facing, but even in their job postings, and offering accessible online booking options. I've seen more of that specify what accessibility features are available. I know Sean talked about that, and I've seen that more. So I've also seen an increase in staff training. I think that's also improving from the hotel perspective. More of them are utilizing available training on disability awareness. And I've seen this because the HLA offers a training actually through our Tourism Works platform, which I'll briefly mention. So the HLA actually partnered with Tourism HR Canada last year to produce and promote accessible tourism, and the course is called Belong Accessible Tourism Workplaces. And it's an e-learning course. It's comprised of 8 modules, and there's 3 different paths. There's one for frontline workers, middle management, and for senior leaders. And this course has just been utilized quite a bit. And we've also run some workshops that a lot of our hotel members were really keen to take. So they're showing a lot of interest in wanting to learn more about how they can create more or just be more inclusive at their workplace. But as as Sean mentioned, there's kind of always room to grow. The industry can always look to continue to improve. Something that I've found so helpful is consulting people with disabilities directly when making a design decision or a policy decision, like thinking about even how you're laying your towels out in the room. Like, is someone able to grab that? Or I think it was mentioned having lower peepholes. So it's important that you consult with the individuals who are requiring those accommodations. And then, yeah, like I mentioned, expanding staff training to really make it more accessible to those with invisible disabilities or neurodiversity, and sharing best practices and success stories between properties, right? Like, what are you doing at your property to be more accommodating or more inclusive? What design changes have you made? And kind of learning from each other, I think, is also another great way that they could improve.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are great points. Thank you so much for sharing, Natalie. Melissa, the commission, of course, deals with complaints and issues of discrimination. So I'd be interested to know what are some of the common accessibility and hospitality related questions that come our way.
So the commission continues to receive inquiries about service animals, which I talked a bit before about that, and the people who rely on them struggling to access public places generally. So more broadly in services in public transportation or access to public buildings, government services, but also in hospitality. So that's something we continue to receive quite a few inquiries about. So I thought it might be worth talking a bit about that. It can be a complicated situation. when service providers also are balancing obligations they have under other legislation, like public health or occupational health and safety. And so what we've seen in human rights case law about this issue is that if someone requires an animal in connection to a disability, a service provider has a duty to accommodate, again, up to that point of undue hardship. And it's also possible that the duty to accommodate could arise regardless of if the animal is a certified service dog or not, something like an emotional support animal that's supported by medical information. So what we've seen in these previous decisions, which, like I said, have mostly come from other public services, is that number one, it's reasonable in light of a policy generally prohibiting animals on a premises for a service provider to respectfully ask questions about the legitimacy of a service dog or a service animal. And number two, that the person seeking accommodation has an obligation to establish through medical information that they require their animal to function due to a disability. And so these previous decisions can provide some helpful guidance for hospitality providers when they're navigating these issues.
That's great. Thanks, Melissa. Perfect answer to round out that question and some really good considerations. I know service dogs are always a really important topic in the hospitality industry. Thank you to all of our panelists for those great answers. I'm going to move along to our fifth question of the day. When issues of discrimination or a need for accommodation arises, what role or responsibilities do customers have in raising their issues or concerns? Natalie, I'll turn to you first for this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Customers play a really important role in helping service providers uphold human rights. It's not just about what businesses do, it's also about creating space for guests to speak up when something isn't working. If someone experiences a barrier, discrimination, or they have an accommodation need, they should feel empowered to raise it or to talk about it, respectfully, of course. But whether it's a quick conversation with a front desk manager or submitting feedback through that formal process, it's important to speak up, and speaking up early gives the business a chance to respond and to learn. I think a really good example of this was during the wildfires in 2023 and 2024. Hotels were suddenly hosting, really large numbers of displaced people, often with very little time to prepare. An evacuation would happen, and it would be very chaotic. And, these people's lives are being greatly affected. So tensions were really high, and unfortunately, we saw an increase in human rights complaints from both guests and actually even on the employee side. But even in that really tough situation, there were a lot of lessons that were learned, and a lot of hotels really had to adapt very quickly and grow through that experience, learning how to better support people in crisis and how to communicate more clearly and how to respond with greater empathy. So yes, customers have a voice, and when they use it, it can lead to real, positive change. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Natalie. Those are really important points and a reminder to all of us of the role that we also play as customers. And I think the wildfire evacuations is a really good example, as I know that was a time of growth and learning for the industry. Melissa, I'm going to open this up to you next. What role do customers play in raising issues of accommodation or discrimination?
Sure. So human rights law, establishes that both parties have responsibilities in the accommodation process. So the customer or the service recipient, the person who needs accommodation, their responsibility is to make their need for accommodation known. And in some situations, they might have an obligation to provide information to support their request. So a bit more about what their needs are. And when they do that, the responsibility then shifts to the service provider, who has an obligation to provide accommodation to the point of undue hardship. And really, this process is meant to be cooperative and collaborative, and both parties have an obligation to be reasonable. Human rights law establishes that a service recipient is not entitled necessarily to a perfect or an instant or their preferred accommodation. Reasonable accommodation is the standard. And so, of course, that works better when everybody is working together to come to a solution that works for everybody.
Great, thank you, Melissa. I think that's really good context to have on the duty to accommodate and the flexibility required by both parties. I actually have a follow-up as well, based on the questions we received at registration. We've had a few people asking about what the best practice would be for service providers in accommodating individuals who cannot comply with public health requirements. Could you speak to this?
Sure. Yeah, this can be really challenging to manage accommodations, again, where somebody's needs conflict with other rules or standards, including public health requirements. And we saw a number of inquiries and complaints around masking requirements during the pandemic and somebody's need to not wear a mask being in conflict with public health requirements. So it's a challenging situation to manage for sure. In terms of best practices, if you're responding to an accommodation request that's in some way connected to a public health requirement, you still have to do an individual assessment of what that person's specific needs are and how you might be able to accommodate them. So I would suggest considering creative solutions, possibly seeking some advice in a situation like this, either from the commission or from a lawyer. And if you are in a situation where you're unable to accommodate due to a public health requirement because of strict rules associated with that, make sure to document what's going on there, communicate the reasons clearly and respectfully to the person, and make sure you're monitoring for changes in those public health requirements that might allow you to be more flexible over time. So, staying current, making sure you're adjusting as things change.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Melissa. That's really good advice. And then Sean, what are your thoughts on the role of customers in raising issues of discrimination?
Yeah, I think Melissa indicated it a few times when she was chatting there and saying specific need. And so, I think that there's a balance both from the individuals and the organizations on accommodation. And I think one of the biggest kind of social responsibilities that individuals that aren't experiencing their needs being met adequately is to bring up that concern, raise the concern. Don't just leave the business or the establishment without taking the time to address or at least signify what those are. And there's constructive ways about going about that. I know there's also kind of a threshold that people feel like it's been ignored for such a long time, and there's probably kind of a frustration that exists within that. But I also believe that nothing's done fully intentionally. And so when there is, an oversight or a missed opportunity for accommodation, by recognizing it and bringing that forward as an individual, you're doing it for a broader group of individuals, because should that accommodation find resolution with the business, that business now then has that within their structure and within their system to accommodate any other people, whether that's an employee or a guest, to follow. And so, we're kind of cursed as Canadians where we have this polite stick, where we oftentimes just, leave a business, leave an establishment frustrated, but saying nothing. And that frustration kind of builds and builds because you keep going and experiencing maybe the same gap in accommodation or service or support, but without recognizing it, without bringing it forward, without finding that, we can still be Canadian about it, we can still do it in a constructive way. But again, by taking the time to recognize that and support the businesses that, are taking the time to bring in those accommodations and bring it forward to those that have yet to incorporate that into their systems, it's truly the only way this can evolve. We're rapidly trying to incorporate accessibility and disability inclusion into the space that exists. And unfortunately, we don't live in the ideal scenario where this can be done immediately. And so there is a process, there is an evolution to all of this. And, through collaborative engagement by organizations reaching out and connecting with different people who live with different types of experiences and disabilities, utilizing the resources that have been listed and the others that exist, to really understand how can they incorporate that best practices, how can they optimize the experiences that they're offering both to clients and team members and employees. We can see this start to cultivate and manifest quickly, because again, it is evolving, it is changing. The building codes are changing quickly. The human rights criteria and legislation is changing quickly. These are evolving because I think we have ground that needs to be made up. And so how can we do that? Supporting both kind of sides of the table and communities as a whole.
Great, thank you, Sean. That's a really great perspective, and really highlights everyone's answers. Actually, the role that we have as customers, and I think it's something we can all relate to because we will all be customers at some point. So really useful considerations for us to all take from today. Moving along to our final question of the day already. I can't believe how fast our time together has gone. I'd like to know what tools or resources are available to help hospitality providers and employers meet their human rights responsibilities. Sean, could you kick us off and share your thoughts on resources that the hospitality industry can access to support human rights?
Absolutely. Yeah, as kind of what's been indicated so far, there's a number of resources that are publicly available through government or not-for-profit organizations, both from training as well as design or engagement. So creating your own kind of round table of lived experience or any of this, a lot of organizations are starting to offer these lenses and perspectives that also often come with little to no cost. There's a number of evolving ASL interpretation apps that exist. Deaf and Hear Alberta have one that they've put out. So it's not a matter of having your staff trained with ASL, but at least having that engagement mechanism exist at points of interaction with clients, and so that can be something that's offered and detailed in the way that you can offer services to different people. There's a ton of digital tools that exist as well through having spaces audited or assessed. I guess audit's a little bit of a scary word. And providing again digital resources and accessibility upgrades to your digital spaces. So through your booking programs or through your websites, how can you upgrade those to meet higher accessibility standards and criteria? And what are the things that you can put in? Userway.org has another really great band-aid, if you will, while you're doing these upgrades to provide, screen supplementive supports to navigate the site more intuitively and more holistically for people of all different types of disabilities. And of course, there's accessibility consultants, people that can come in and help create a custom solution and really work with you and your team to provide insight and really address it as kind of a holistic approach to the entire business entity, as opposed to an ad hoc kind of solution base as kind of you're putting out the fires as they arise. How can you be more proactive towards truly approaching accessibility and disability inclusion and doing it kind of in a thoughtful manner?
Great, thank you, Sean. Those are really good suggestions and kind of a larger theme today about being proactive and ensuring that we have these considerations flowing throughout our work instead of being ad hoc afterthoughts. Natalie, I know that this is a big part of your work. Any resource suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good time for me to highlight the AHLA's Human Rights Toolkit for hoteliers. So this was specifically created for Alberta hotels, and it's really practical and easy to use. I know when it comes to legislation, there's a lot of information, and sometimes it can be difficult to go through and pull out the things that are really pertinent to your business. So with this toolkit, we've also created a lot of additional resources like hiring checklists. There's those candidate evaluation forms. There's interview do's and don'ts, and There's a whole reasonable accommodation guide. There's tons and tons of resources and templates in there. And so these tools are, really designed to help employers take the Alberta Human Rights Act and actually apply it in real world situations, whether that's during their recruitment or their onboarding or just their day-to-day guest service. So it's a really fantastic resource. It's available through the AHLA. Unfortunately, at this point in time, it is only available to hotels, but those hotels in the province that are a part of our association and they're subscribed to our Tourism Works platform can access that. There's also a lot of other trainings out there. I know Sean mentioned just some of the other fantastic things that are available. Tourism HR Canada is the Canadian Association for Tourism on the federal level, and they have a ton of things on their website regarding accessibility. They have training, additional resources. They have consultants that can come to your property and meet with you, or come to your business and meet with you, so long as you're within the hospitality sector. And kind of evaluate areas that you could make your workplace more accessible to both guests and employees. And then, as I mentioned before, the HLA has also worked with THRC to create and administer that Belong Accessible Tourism Workplaces training. And that's an e-learning that's easily accessible for your staff, or like your frontline staff, your managers, and even senior leaders. And that talks about everything from, introductory concepts to accessibility and inclusion, all the way up into creating an accessibility strategy at a very high level, from like an executive leadership position. So that's a really fantastic resource as well, and that's available through Tourism Works as well, which is our training platform. So plus, yeah, the commission has so many things, but I'll let Melissa speak to that because she'll be better than that at me.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Good to hear about the work you have underway, and thanks for also highlighting some other resources and trainings that exist. Melissa, you've already been mentioned. What commission resources exist to support the hospitality industry?
Sure. So in addition to the Hospitality Guide, which is our topic today, the Commission has quite a number of relevant resources, including some other in-depth human rights guides, like Leisha said earlier on, specifically one on the duty to accommodate, other employment-related guides as well. So there's also information sheets to support organizations and employers in human rights and developing anti-discrimination and harassment policies. There's information about the different protected grounds and what they mean, information related to pre-employment inquiries, what you can and can't ask before you're hiring someone, information for employers on appearance and dress codes, which could be helpful for the hospitality industry. So all of these resources are available on our website and can be viewed there or downloaded. And all of these resources can support employers in ensuring that their workplaces are inclusive and fair and free from discrimination. And we've mentioned it a couple times already, but I'll repeat it one more time. We also do have a confidential inquiry line that you can call and speak to a human rights officer who's an expert in human rights law about any questions you might have. And they can help talk you through our complaint process, what human rights law says, what your obligations are, and give you some information that might help you make decisions about any specific situations that you're dealing with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa, and a huge thank you to our panel for your thoughtful answers and for providing all this really great information today. You've given us all a lot to think about and take with us in our work, so thank you so much. I've now just put on the screen some contact information. If you are wanting to follow up on any of the amazing resources that were just mentioned, we do have some contact information there. Or if there's anything more that you would like to know, please feel free to reach out to our panel and connect and learn more. I really appreciated the discussion today, and I'm so thankful that you've taken the time to join us and share your expertise. We've also shared some information in the chat if you are looking to get in touch with any of our panelists and learn more and follow up on anything from today's discussion. And with that, we have reached the end of today's webinar. I'd like to thank you all, Melissa, Natalie, Sean. Thank you so much for sharing your time, expertise, and experience with us regarding human rights in the hospitality industry. It's been a really fantastic discussion and it's given us a lot to think about and, more importantly, action and bring it to our work. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for including me.
Thanks, Leisha.
Our pleasure. Thank you. You'll now see a quick survey on your screen, and we ask that you please take a few seconds to complete this. This information is invaluable to us as we evaluate today's session and plan for future webinars. Speaking of future webinars, we are offering another webinar on December 2nd on medical information and human rights at work. We've shared a registration link to that in the chat as well if you're interested in attending. We'd love to see you again next month. We also welcome you to follow the Commission on our various social media channels as well, whether it's LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook, to keep receiving timely updates from us. A final thanks to our incredible panelists and to everyone who took the time to attend today's session. We look forward to welcoming you to future learning opportunities. And with that, take care and see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Take care.